This year has been very slow when it comes to the home arcade market, and a lot of that, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, does come down to Arcade 1UP not really going too heavy at their units this year. But with that being said, I started to take notice at other brands and what they were doing. And one in particular that I saw that hit the market earlier this year was Iconic Arcade. And I'll be transparent, my initial impressions of this unit weren't great. I saw the store displays at GameStop and I wasn't overly fond of the wrapping or the design that they had for the unit itself. And I was less impressed with the buttons and the game selection that was on the store display unit. And as the year progressed, however, I kind of started digging into Iconic Arcade and what it really was designed for and who it was designed for. And I started to become a bit more intrigued with this device. However, the biggest barrier and the biggest risk to me did seem like the price tag. As I recall, these units earlier this year debuted around $500 or $600 at GameStops. However, we've recently had a big price drop on them in Canada for about $300. And to make it even better, in Canada, we don't have tax on things like electronics for the next month or so. So I decided to bite the bullet and pick one of these units up. And in this video, I'm going to go over my thoughts on the unit as a whole, who I think it's really designed for, and the things I really like about the unit and the things that I dislike. So let's take a look. So one thing I want to highlight to start is that this is not a pre-assembled unit. This is something that you have to bring home just like an Arcade 1UP and piece by piece put it together. And one thing I want to mention is the sticker on the box. It mentions that this is designed for people who want to run their own emulators or bring their own arcade compatible games that they've purchased on devices like Steam and play them on this device. And the thing that I think I initially got this device mixed up for, and I just want to highlight this, is that I thought originally what this was you purchased this device kind of like an Arcade 1UP and you had a bunch of games with a standard game store built in. And that's not quite the case with this device. This is essentially a multi-cade. This is a multi-cade in a box. So you get all the parts, all the components, everything ready to go, and essentially you add your own games or add your own ROMs to this device, or you mod it as you see fit. And when I realized that that's what this device was for, or who this was for, I started to find myself a little bit more warm to the idea, because I myself, I've dabbled into modding my own previous 1UPs, but not too deeply. And to be transparent with you, it's a time investment. It just seems like something I didn't want to invest a ton of time into doing. So I like the idea that this is essentially a multi-cade in a box. It's essentially a pre-assembled or a unit that you can assemble that has everything you need to get going quick. And unboxing this device, initially I was a bit overwhelmed by all the different components to build the unit. I thought it was going to be a lot more difficult than I thought. And I know some people are against this, but I've always used a drill to assemble all of my 1UP units. But with this, you just get an Allen key and the actual screws, and basically you match up the holes and Allen key everything together. I initially thought this was going to be a daunting task, but to be transparent, whoever engineered all these different pieces, they got the perfect ratio for the screws to the size of the actual holes, and it felt really quick to actually assemble this. I was surprised. And even when I got to some of the more interior components like the wiring, it looked overwhelming, but once I realized that this was just a couple different areas that you had to plug in on the diagram, it was very straightforward and ultimately very easy to set this up and build this unit. Now, once the machine's built, one thing I do want to highlight is the aesthetics. I myself was not ultra fond of the design. I like the Iconic Arcade logo. I'm not sure I like how it's plastered all over the device with these weird, somewhat retro type accents, but they just don't look very tasteful. I also would have been cool to have gotten a light up marquee. I know some of you guys are diehards for light up marquees. I myself won't say that I am, but when it comes to the actual marquee itself, it's pretty generic. It just has the iconic arcade plaster on it. But one thing I want to highlight is the actual quality control of the unit itself. Now, again, I'm pretty laid back with most of these units. I know I hear guys moaning about how sometimes the molding on an arcade 1-up isn't completely 100% perfect. I don't necessarily care about those things. One thing I do want to highlight though is on the iconic arcade, on where the molding should be, you see almost like a ton of imperfections, almost like someone pulled off a piece of stripping or something and tried to re-glue it back on. Now, it's not something that's a deal breaker, but out of the gate, it just doesn't look the greatest or give me the greatest impression of the device. It almost looks like I assembled it myself or tried to paint it myself. The other thing as well is there's a bunch of little nicks and pieces that are kind of banged up that came just out of the box. I myself have never had that experience with any of the 1-ups I've assembled, so this is kind of new to me. It's unfortunate because, again, it's a brand new unit. Now, is it enough for me to complain to the point I'm going to return this? Absolutely not, but it is something that I do notice on the unit, and I did notice on a couple of the components that did kind of detract from the actual overall look of the device. Now, what I do want to highlight though is getting past the actual building of the unit and getting into using the actual device. So what this is built for is Batocera, which, and I think I said that right, which is essentially just a bunch of different emulators compiled into one, kind of like a RetroArch of some sort, but essentially it plays every single console under the sun. And so getting that installed onto this device though wasn't the simplest task. So this does have Wi-Fi built into it, but when I use, so you have to put in a USB setup stick and then a SD card in the back of the unit. I believe the SD card has some of the Batocera on it, or it's blank and you have to flash Batocera onto it. I'm not completely sure. But long story short, you put the USB in, you put in the SD card, and then you go through the setup options. Now that seems simple enough, but what ended up happening is you get through the setup options, you get through the god-awful inputting of your Wi-Fi password, and for some reason, it just didn't work for me. It did not work at all, and thank God for the iconic arcade tiny fan page community online, because I was clued into, well, maybe you need to try this using a wired Ethernet cord, as a lot of people have had issues using Wi-Fi to try to set up the device, which might not seem like a big deal, but in the geography of my home, I have to basically take this unit off, bring it all the way upstairs, hardwire it into Ethernet, and then get it set up. And I was fortunate enough that that did work. And it took about 45 minutes or so for it to download everything it needed to initialize everything, set everything up, and then finally you have Batocera on the device. The reason I'm overemphasizing the setup, however, is, well, I'm technologically savvy enough to figure these things out, and I was, cognizant enough of being able to reach out to the iconic arcade group and kind of figure out how that all worked. I could see somebody who's not technologically savvy finding this to be very headache inducing and very difficult to actually get going, to the point that they might be turned off by this unit entirely, which is something that when you look at a device like a 1-up or even the iArcades that were on the market a couple years ago, they were kind of designed with that consumer friendliness in mind, whereas the iconic arcade is consumer friendly enough to people who are technologically savvy, if that makes sense. But regardless, once you have Batocera set up, there's a couple little quirks that you need to be aware of. And what I mean by that is, this isn't a plug in your USB drive, copy over all your ROMs and it works sort of device. This is designed to use your shared Wi-Fi network to drag and drop ROMs from your computer right onto your iconic arcade. Now, as I understand, there is a way to get these different games from a USB stick to the device, but it's not cut and dry. It's not just plug and play. It takes a bit of workaround. I found the easiest method was having this set up on my shared network and then just dragging and dropping my ROMs onto the actual device, which in some cases was slow, some cases was pretty efficient, but I found this works, and I've done this and added basically large libraries for every console under the sun. Now, out of the gate, without you having to do too much legwork, this natively supports GBA games, this supports Game Boy Color games, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis games, N64 games. I was also able to get Dreamcast games working on it. Now, one thing I do want to highlight is all the 2D devices, and Neo Geo as well, but all the 2D devices that are 2D consoles that I was emulating on this ran fantastic, and in my opinion ran incredibly well. Going into 3D devices, this is running a Raspberry Pi 4. So going into 3D games or 3D consoles, it was a mixed bag. N64 appeared to give me the most trouble, so I was able to emulate some games like Mortal Kombat 4. Smash Brothers was very up and down in terms of it working good in some cases, but then lagging so badly that it didn't work at all. Dreamcast, believe it or not, for the 4 games or so that I tried, all appeared to, with the exception of Dead or Alive 2, all appeared to emulate quite well. And not just playable, but emulated almost what seemed like the original versions on the Dreamcast, which was great to me. So that is something to consider, and I'm actually quite excited that I can increase the amount of different Dreamcast games that I played, as I have a very deep fondness for that console. But it seems like for 3D games, if you're going in with an expectation you're going to be emulating PS2 or, your whole N64 library, that's probably not going to happen with this device. But it is good to know that things like Dreamcast do appear to work somewhat well on this unit. Now, moving a bit further, a couple things I do want to touch on is the actual control panel. So the joysticks themselves, or the arcade sticks themselves, they feel pretty good. What I dislike is the buttons. They feel way too tight and way too springy. Now, I know some people upgrade their arcade 1-ups to have a similar feeling to this. I myself don't like it as much. I feel like I really have to push down hard to get these buttons to feel like they're actually pressing in and working. And to me, I would say that's one of the biggest detracting points from this device. Now, does it deem it unplayable? Absolutely not. But in some cases, it just doesn't feel like it's as smooth as it should be. I myself am more appreciative of like my bar top Visco unit that has a nice clickiness to it, but not a ton of resistance, whereas this seems like there's just a bit too much resistance in the actual buttons. I'm not sure how hard it would be to mod them to change that out, but that is something that I definitely want to highlight for people who are interested in pursuing or purchasing this device. Now, another thing I want to highlight is the sound. Of all of the arcade units that I've used or owned here, I would argue that this outputs the best possible sound. I've tested it on a bunch of different games. You have dual speakers at the top. You have an actual physical dial on the top of the actual unit, and it works very, very well. It sounds really good. It sounds really crisp. I've even cranked it to full blast, and I didn't get any weird artifacting in the sounds or any sort of, bad output overall, which I really liked. A couple other features that I do want to highlight with this unit is that what this device also has built in is actually a media player as well, which you can use to stream different things, which might not seem like a big deal, but I myself have given up a lot of the real estate in my basement, my very small basement, to house all these units, and as a result, I pretty much don't really have a active TV, so I like the fact that I have the ability to transfer movies over to this as well and access different streaming platforms through this device and be able to use it for those things while I'm playing on different units within this arcade, or even when I have people over. So that is something that I do want to highlight as well. Now, I do want to emphasize this is running on a Raspberry Pi 4, so these are just what Iconic Arcade essentially packaged in and recommends that you download and install for their device. But I've seen other people on the Iconic Arcade fan page use different services, different platforms, different emulators with different varying levels of success. So in other words, if you don't like what's packed in with this device, do keep in mind that you can also change them out or you know, install different programs or different platforms on this device. So one final thing I want to go over though, however, is the actual screen. So the screen is what I would categorize as okay, but it's not great. Now, what I mean by that is it's not as vibrant as the BOE monitors that I have on some of my units back here, but it's acceptable when you're facing it head on. It looks good enough, especially when you're playing games, it seems to look good enough. But when you start looking at it from different angles, I do find that it doesn't hold up as great as it should. Now, it's not as bad as like the Pac-Mania unit from Arcade1Up, but it is something I noticed that if you're looking at it from an angle and not head on, it does appear to look washed out and you get that weird ghosting look on the actual image, which for some people might be a bit of a deal breaker. But I do want to report that this unit is about 4 or 5 inches wider than a general 1-up. So unlike some of the 1-up units where if you're playing a 2-player game, you feel like you have to be off to the side to play it to actually accommodate 2 people, I would say this is the perfect width to accommodate 2 people, keep you facing it head on, so you're not really noticing that ghosting that could happen with the screen like you would on some of the 1-up units that are a little bit more compact. So overall, I think for the price point of $300, this is a great multi-cade unit. However, I think you need to go in with the expectation that you should know how to operate a computer and have general experience with operating technology to actually assemble this. One of the big detracting points I will argue, and probably one of the issues that this unit will have on shelves with a lot of consumers, is that it's not consumer friendly enough that it's just plug it and play and you're good to go. It takes a bit of legwork, as I felt, to get it going, and I'm quite versed with computers myself. So I do want to highlight that, because if you're someone watching this review and you're going in with this impression that this is out of the box, you're good to go, it's not going to be the case. And you also have to keep in mind that while this does come packed in with a couple, like they seem like arcade clone games, you really don't get much out of the box. There's not like 10 preloaded games like an Arcade1Up that are known brand name games. These are all kind of unknown arcade clones that are just thrown in just to keep it simple, but they're not really exciting enough to justify the cost of the unit. So you should also be going in with the expectation that you're gonna be adding ROM packs or a bunch of different games to this unit of your own choosing when you're purchasing this. This is, again, not a plug it and play, get this set up and you're good to go and never really have to look back. This does take a bit of legwork, and all in all, I probably put 4 hours between building it, downloading ROMs and getting them all set up and transferred over and the whole device itself set up before I could actually really experience and play this device, which in my mind is quicker than building my own multi-cade and sourcing a bunch of different parts, but it's still something that you should be aware of when you are considering purchasing this device. Now, it does, again, have some great features. I like the sizing of it. I generally like the joystick. I think that this outputs fantastic quality sound. I also think that the Raspberry Pi4 that this includes is powerful enough to run almost any 2D based console that it's emulating, and apparently, as through my testing, some 3D consoles. So I think you have more than enough power under the actual device to play everything you like. And I think the screen's good enough. Now, of course, there's, again, some detracting points. The buttons aren't the greatest. And while the screen is good enough, it is something to consider that if you're looking at this from the side or looking at this from an angle, that it's not going to hold up like it would on a BOE monitor for some of the 1-up units that I have. If you consider those factors though, but you look at the price tag, I think that there is a lot to like here. I think that for a multi-cade out of the box, something that gives me the opportunity to emulate every single game under the sun that I've enjoyed playing while I was growing up, I think that there's a lot of value here once you can get through the initial hurdles of getting it set up and getting it actually running the stuff you want it to run. And looking at that $300 price tag, I do hope that this doesn't mean Iconic Arcades on clearance. I do understand from their website that they are putting out newer units and more appealing looking units as well down the line, which is a good thing. I just think that they probably need to approach the consumer friendliness of their devices a little better. And I think they might have a gem on their hands for a lot of people. But other than those couple little points that I brought up, I think there's great value for the $300 that this unit actually cost.